All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I see we have about 250 participants on so far, and the number just keeps going up. So I'll go ahead and get started so that we have enough time to get to everything because we have lots of great information to share with you today. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, my name is Tori Ring, and I am the Manager of Veteran Services with NHPCO. This webinar is going to be identifying clinically meaningful moral injury among veterans at end of life. The webinar will run for approximately 1 hour from 3 p.m. Eastern to 4 p.m. Eastern. We are recording the webinar, and the recording will be posted on the We Honor Veterans site by the end of the week. You'll note that the chat is disabled, but we do have the question and answer function available, and we'll have some time for questions after the presentation. So please feel free to put any questions in the Q&A. But with that, I am very excited to welcome Dr. Griffin and Mr. Todd McKee. Brandon Griffin is a clinical psychologist and the Assistant Director of Research for the South Central Mental Illness Research, Education, and Clinical Center at the Central Arkansas Veterans Healthcare System in Little Rock, Arkansas. He studies the effectiveness and implementation of interventions that promote mental health and prevent suicide in veterans. And he is nationally recognized for his work focused on the conceptualization, assessment, and treatment of moral injury. So we are very honored to get to hear from him today. And he is joined by Todd McKee, Master of Divinity, who is a program manager for the PTSD Consultation program at the National Center for PTSD, where he works with a team of expert clinicians to provide resources, education, and consultation to providers who treat veterans in any setting. And so without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Griffin and Mr. McKee.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ring, for inviting this presentation and giving us a chance to talk about identifying clinically meaningful moral injury among veterans at end of life. I really appreciate the opportunity to share what I'll be presenting today and the collaboration between We Honor Veterans, the National Center for PTSD, and the Central Arkansas VA. Thank you for those great introductions. Just a little bit about the purpose of this presentation. We will review moral injury, including its key concepts, key aspects of its definition, and how it may appear in clinical interactions with veterans, including how it is different from PTSD. The views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the Department of Veteran Affairs or U.S. government, and presenters Griffin and McKee have no financial conflicts of interest to disclose. At the conclusion of this activity, you will be able to define moral injury and discuss its impact on veterans' well-being, to use the moral injury and distress scale to assess for probable moral injury in veterans, and discuss the application of moral injury care at the end of life among veterans. So let's jump into our first objective. In December 2022, the U.S. Congress passed the Support the Resiliency of Our Nation's Great Veterans, or Strong Veterans Act of 2022. This was the first time that moral injury appeared in any U.S. congressional legislation, and it specifically required the Office of Research and Development at Department of Veterans Affairs to conduct research on moral injury as it relates to mental health care and suicide prevention in veterans. I share it with you all today to demonstrate kind of the importance that is being assigned to moral injury among veterans, and to underscore that if Congress is talking about it, we should probably make sure that we are informed about this issue that's facing veterans as well. So moral injury refers to distress and impairment resulting from exposure to an event that transgresses a person's beliefs about acceptable conduct, or what they think is right and wrong. Hallmark indicators of moral injury include an intractable sense of guilt and shame, self-sabotaging behavior. In many cases, people will believe that they don't deserve good things like to be happy or have healthy relationships or to have a good job. They will withdraw from valued relationships and communities, and they'll feel a lack of meaning or purpose in their life. Moral injury, like other stress-related symptoms, can be linked back to exposure to an event or a series of events with a similar theme. In this case, individuals may be exposed to potentially morally injurious events in multiple ways. The first is that they might transgress their own beliefs either by what they did or failed to do. So they would feel some sense of personal responsibility for a potentially morally injurious event, or PMIE, because of what they did, or a commission, or what they failed to do, an omission. Individuals may also witness or learn about others within a shared group, like a military or healthcare organization, acting in ways that they believe is morally wrong. So in this case, they would feel some collective responsibility for a PMIE, even though they may not have been directly involved. Some common examples of military-related PMIEs include participating in a firefight where civilians may have been injured or killed, especially vulnerable individuals such as older adults, non-combatant women, and children. In addition, there are other types of events that would include failing to prevent a fellow service member from being injured or killed in action, regardless of how successful the mission was, or even witnessing civilians suffer from poverty, famine, or terrorism and not being able to help them. So we know that exposure to potentially morally injurious events is related to some adverse outcomes among veterans. And so here I have an example for you from a study that looked at a nationally representative sample of post 9/11 veterans. And those who were exposed to a potentially morally injurious event were up to 2 times as likely to attempt suicide after separating from military service. This was particularly so for men versus women in the military, and for those who endorsed participating in a PMIE because of what they did or failed to do, versus those who just witnessed others' wrongful actions. An important point here is that in this study, exposure to a potentially morally injurious event explained risk for suicide attempt above and beyond many other important risk factors like PTSD, depression, pre-military history of suicide ideation and attempt. So it was a very rigorous test of the association between moral injury and suicide risk to show that moral injury explains who might attempt suicide above and beyond many of the other risk factors that we know about. There's numerous other correlates of PMIE exposure as well, though. Individuals exposed to potentially morally injurious events tend to report higher levels of post-traumatic stress, depression, difficulties with insomnia, impaired relationship functioning, decreased productivity at work or occupational functioning, and even poor health behavior. So just to kind of get a sense of participants' exposure to moral injury, I want to throw out a poll question that you can just reflect on for yourself. Moral injury and PTSD are distinct responses to different kinds of highly stressful events. True or false? So if you've spent much time looking through the moral injury literature, you're probably familiar with this, that people tend to talk about moral injury and PTSD as distinct responses to different kinds of highly stressful events. Often they'll be spoken about as different trauma types. We have seen that in veterans, 35% of veterans with PTSD and 9% of those without PTSD tend to report participating in a PMIE. 50% of veterans with PTSD and 20% of those without PTSD report witnessing a PMIE. So even though these are distinct responses to different kinds of highly stressful events, they do tend to co-occur in veterans quite frequently. A little bit about the differences between moral injury and PTSD, as well as their similarities. Both are stress-related symptoms. So this is a cluster of mental health problems that we link back to exposure to a specific event or series of similarly themed events. Moral injury involves exposure to an event in which there's a perceived transgression of a person's internalized beliefs about what is right and wrong. On the other hand, PTSD involves exposure to an event involving actual or threatened death, serious injury, or the threat to physical integrity. Whereas there are formalized diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5 and ICD for PTSD, there are no formalized diagnostic criteria for moral injury. And whereas assessment and treatment has been incorporated into many aspects of routine VA care, this is not the case for moral injury at this point. So moving on to our second objective, which is about using the moral injury and distress scale, or the MIDS, as I'll refer to it in this presentation, to assess for probable moral injury in veterans. So this is a copy of the MIDS that I, along with Shira McGann and Sonia Norman, led a team with the National Center for PTSD to develop. The MIDS is composed of two different parts. In part one, we assess for exposure to a potentially morally injurious event, because it's important to index symptoms attributed to moral injury to exposure to some specific event. In this case, we have 3 items here that assess for exposure to a PMIE by what one did, what one failed to do, and what one witnessed. And then there are optional open response questions in which respondents can write a few sentences about the event to which they were exposed, as well as aspects of it that are most upsetting, and parts of what they wish they would have done differently, to kind of get a sense about how they're interpreting or appraising this event. Each item is rated on a 5-point response format, ranging from not at all to extremely. And participants or respondents who endorse at least one of these items, indicating that they were exposed to a potentially morally injurious event, then go on to part 2 of the MIDS, which includes 18 items that focus on cognitive, emotional, social, and spiritual sequelae of exposure to a potentially morally injurious event, or just moral injury for short. We do encourage respondents to describe the extent to which they've experienced each of the problems in the items within the past month. Either not at all, a little, moderately, quite a bit, or extremely. You can change the time zone, or the time period which is being assessed, from lifetime to last month or last week. But in our initial validation, we focused on past month symptoms. So I want to give you a little bit of kind of what's under the hood in terms of developing the MIDS. And so starting with item generation, we initially looked in the literature, as well as reflected on our own clinical experiences, for theoretical models of moral injury, and then drafted 41 what we'll call candidate items to assess potential cognitive, emotional, social, and spiritual reactions to PMIE exposure. We then had 4 subject matter experts in psychological trauma review those candidate items and suggest revisions that were incorporated into the scale. Next, we pre-tested those items with a number of different potential respondents or consumers. Whereas the moral injury literature, it initially focused solely on veterans, we wanted the MIDS to be applicable to a number of military and civilian components. So we looked at consumers that included veterans engagement groups, but also first responders, including police, fire, and emergency medical personnel, and healthcare providers. It's important to note that we actually collected these data in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a time when, especially in news media and in the scientific literature, there was a lot of discussion about healthcare workers having to make similarly high-stakes decisions with limited time and information as veterans had been used to making. And so moral injury had kind of generalized from the military to civilian healthcare working setting. These individual interviews focused on each of the consumers' reactions to the scale and how we could improve fit for respondents like them. We then contracted with Ipsos to administer the survey in an electronic form to a nationally representative sample of military veterans, first responders, and healthcare workers. So there were about 400 or so of individuals from each of the categories. And then we weighted those responses to nationally represented benchmarks for American adults. So I had mentioned previously that we had 41 candidate items. We wanted to winnow those items so that we could get down to the ones that were best to include in what would eventually become the MIDS. We did that in a couple of ways. First, we limited our sample to those who described some valid exposure to a potentially morally injurious event. So those first 6 items that I showed you on the MIDS, they had to endorse at least one of those to then follow to the 18 symptom focus items. Then we winnowed items in a couple of ways. One was by calculating an item discrimination index, which helped us determine which items were best at distinguishing respondents who scored low and high on the scale. If an item wasn't any good at distinguishing those who scored low and high on the overall scale, then we dropped it, and we ended up dropping 2 items. We also wanted to eliminate redundant items. So we looked at items, dyads that were highly correlated. And when they were highly correlated, we only kept the one item in that dyad that was a better discriminator between those who scored high and low on the overall scale. And we eliminated 7 items that way. We then moved to extracting factors and split the sample into initial validation and cross-validation subsamples so that we would be able to extract an initial factor structure and replicate it in the cross-validation sample. Our exploratory factor analyses used a technique called parallel analysis in order to identify that initial factor structure, and findings did support a single factor solution in the initial validation subsample. We then moved to the cross-validation subsample to use confirmatory factor analysis and found a good fitting model suggesting that that single factor solution replicated. So the hats that I wear in the different spaces that I work, I am a frontline clinician in the outpatient PTSD clinic at Cavis, and I also have a statistical and psychometric role on many of the projects when I'm involved in. And because of that, I am always looking for a scale that has really strong psychometrics to administer to patients that I'm seeing in my clinic. But I also really want it to be practically easy to use and interpret. And I know I'm throwing a lot of kind of statistical jargon out talking about factor structures, but this is meaningful to me as a clinician because I like to be able to sum the items together or calculate an average of all the items to get an overall composite that then tells me the severity of a patient's presenting symptoms. And that is what I think is so important about the MIDS, is that we would say that this is a single factor scale or unidimensional scale, meaning that all of these 18 items assessing the cognitive, the social, the emotional, and the spiritual consequences of moral injury can be aggregated into one composite score that tells me as a clinician how severe this veteran's symptoms are. We also wanted to know that the scale worked well across the different populations that we wanted to be able to assess. And so we looked to make sure that this single factor structure replicated just in the healthcare workers, just in the veterans, and just in the first responders. And the statistics that we used in order to assess this are examine measurement invariance between these different known occupational groups. And they revealed that measurement models were very similar across the populations with only minor item level differences. An example of an item level difference that fell out was that veterans were more likely to endorse the item "I should not be forgiven" than were first responders. And so these minor item level differences we chalked up to some of the differences in ethos among the populations. For example, first responders tend to show up on a scene after there's been some crisis or accident, and they are trying to be helpful, although they're not the cause of the suffering, whereas veterans may feel like they are the cause of the suffering. And we think that this difference in kind of the ethos of the different occupations may be what impacts the item level differences, especially on an item like "I should not be forgiven." Whenever you're administering scales, you want to make sure that they are reliable, and we tested reliability in a couple of different ways for MIDS. The first is we wanted to make sure that these 18 items, looking at all these different kinds of symptoms that people sometimes experience, really hang together to give you an overall impression of moral distress symptom severity. And in fact, they do. The internal consistency for MIDS scores was excellent in the full sample and for veterans, healthcare workers, and first responders. We also took a subsample of about 155 folks from our main overall sample and had them complete the MIDS again 2 weeks after their initial survey. And we found that scores on the MIDS 2 weeks after were moderately associated with baseline scores on the MIDS. which is important to note. Previously, there had been some scientific study of moral injury, but all the scales that were used, as you saw in kind of the background information that I shared, assessed exposure to potentially morally injurious events. But I can tell you as a clinician, no matter how much treatment I deliver or how good that treatment is, I'm not going to ever change what a person was exposed to. Once exposure happens, it's constant. And so those scales weren't really useful for detecting therapeutic change over an episode of care. And we wanted to make sure that the MIDS was sensitive to those fluctuations in severity of symptoms, either that change just over time spontaneously or in response to treatment. And so this association between baseline MID scores and the 2-week follow-up is right in the pocket for what we see with other mental health symptom measures that are used to assess change over time, like the PTSD symptom checklist, the PHQ questionnaire for depression. So we were really excited to see that kind of moderate level of stability. We also wanted to examine validity, and to us that meant the degree to which the MIDS was associated with other measures of post-deployment mental health problems. For example, scores on the MIDS were positively and strongly related to trauma-related shame and guilt. In addition, scores on the MIDS were positively related and strongly related to measures of depression and post-traumatic stress, and then also positive and small to moderate associations with difficulties like insomnia and problematic alcohol use. So I think this is one of the biggest things that as a clinician I like about the MIDS, and that is we know that even as healthcare workers that we are exposed, and veterans too are exposed to all kinds of difficult situations that have ethical implication. It's just part of the job. And not everybody who is exposed to a potentially morally injurious event is going to walk away with a moral injury. So you have to have some way of distinguishing normative distress in response to an exposure from that kind of clinically significant distress and functionally impairing moral injury. So to do that, we use signal detection methods to identify the optimally efficient score on the MIDS for detecting probable moral injury. But the catch here is that there's no gold standard for assessing moral injury. If we were looking at something like the PTSD symptom checklist, we might rely on a clinician interview to determine kind of the gold standard for if a person has PTSD. And for those who work in the trauma space, you may be familiar with the clinician-administered PTSD scale or CAPS. But there's no such thing for moral injury. So we had to get clever and kind of triangulate what we thought were proxies for clinically significant moral distress. And we did that by triangulating it between 3 or 4 different symptom scales. And those included the PTSD symptom checklist to measure PTSD symptom severity, the patient health questionnaire to measure depression severity, the trauma-related guilt inventory, which gave us an impression of mild, moderate to severe trauma-related guilt that a person was experiencing. And then finally, this brief inventory for psychosocial functioning, which assesses how a person's doing in their valued relationships, how they're doing like productivity at work or at school, finances, just all these different domains of our life to see if a person had impairment. And when considering all of those criterions together, we found that a score of 27 or greater on the MIDS is indicative of probable moral injury. So I report a few statistics there below for the positive and negative predictive values. And kind of what that means in lay terms is that for a person who scored 27 or higher on the MIDS, 70% of those also scored in the clinically significant range on the PTSD symptom checklist and the patient health questionnaire for depression. And about 50% also scored in the clinically significant range on the trauma-related guilt inventory and brief inventory for psychosocial functioning. And we were happy with that. You know, there's a lot of reasons why a person might have functional impairment. There's a lot of reasons why a person might feel guilty. And there are many reasons not related to moral injury why a person might have PTSD. You know, they're not completely overlapping. And so kind of triangulating right there in where it was a good many of these related problems, but not all of them, were exactly what we were thinking we would find when we were trying to identify an optimal score for identifying probable moral injury. So here was some of the interesting finding that came out of that, because the MIDS is one of the first scales to ever have a cut point for identifying probable moral injury. When we benchmarked our participants to the geodemographic characteristics of the American population for veterans from the 2020 Census Veteran Supplement Survey, we found that 1 in 2 veterans, or just under 50%, endorsed participating in, because of what they did or failed to do, or witnessing a potentially morally injurious event during their military service. But 1 in 20 veterans, or just over 5%, 6% there, screened positive for probable moral injury after adjusting for age, gender, race, and ethnicity. And so that is incredibly important. Both previously, we had used exposure to a potentially morally injurious event as a proxy for someone who's experiencing clinically significant symptoms, but that's no good, because that's going to inflate the number of people that we're thinking would screen positive. And it's not useful in the treatment settings where you and I work, because there's no way that we could serve 50% of veterans that we think have a moral injury because they just screened positive for exposure. But if we can identify those that are likely to experience adverse outcomes because of those exposure, that 1 in 20 veterans, that's a screening that we can do something with and provide care to. Still, I would say that 1 in 20 veterans is quite a lot. If you think about 5 or 6% of the 4 to 5 million post 9/11 veterans that have returned, as well as Vietnam veterans, we're still talking about a sizable number of veterans who potentially might seek care from VA for moral injury. So poll question 2 here that you can kind of reflect on for yourself. Scoring algorithms are available for the 18 MIDS symptom items to 1, obtain a continuous score where higher values indicate greater distress, and 2, a discrete score indicative of probable moral injury. True or false? So the answer to this question is true. The 18-item MIDS assesses cognitive, emotional, social, and spiritual sequelae of moral injury, and it may be summed to create an overall composite with a possible range of 0 to 72, where higher values indicate more severe symptoms, and scores equal to or greater than 27 are indicative of probable moral injury. And that really sets the MIDS apart from numerous other scales that are available to assess moral injury. So moving here to objective 3, discussing the application of moral injury care at end of life among veterans. So a number of evidence-based psychotherapies for post-traumatic stress disorder have been disseminated across the entire VA enterprise that deal with stress-related or trauma-related problems. Moral injury is one of those stress-related problems, and so veterans are very likely to come to VA seeking care for moral injury and end up in prolonged exposure or cognitive processing therapy or EMDR, the various other EVPs that are provided for PTSD. And that's great, because these frontline treatments have been disseminated and give more people access to trauma-informed care than has ever been the case before. And in fact, prolonged exposure has demonstrated some effectiveness for reducing trauma-related guilt, which is common among survivors who've been exposed to stressful life events. And cognitive processing therapy can be really helpful for challenging unrealistic cognitions, a lot of hindsight bias, that sort of thing that shows up with moral injury. So we're very glad to see that veterans with moral injury, and especially when it co-occurs with PTSD, that they're able to access these EVPs for PTSD. That being said, veterans who complete one of the EVPs for PTSD often report residual symptoms after getting the adequate dose of therapy. And one reason for that might be is that they experience some residual stress that's related to moral injury that might be better addressed by a treatment that is explicitly focused on moral injury. In response to that, we've seen a number of interventions be developed in recent years that try to target moral injury in particular. These include interventions like adaptive disclosure, the impact of killing in war treatment, trauma-informed guilt reduction therapy, and each of these treatments kind of targets a different aspect of problematic morally injurious outcomes. For example, adaptive disclosure includes a secular confession process to help people try to come to terms or make sense of the experiences and the guilt and shame that they feel, as well as letter writing and loving kindness meditation to promote self-acceptance and self-compassion. Impact of killing has a CBT framework that targets specifically killing-related thoughts and feelings. For example, I am a monster. The veterans often walk away from combat situations reporting. And there is also focus in IOK specifically on self-forgiveness through letter writing and making amends. And then trauma-informed guilt reduction therapy. It is another kind of cognitive behavioral treatment that focuses on the many ways in which guilt, which initially was supposed to be adaptive, because of whatever reason, has for some reason become non-adaptive in the context of moral injury by helping promote cognitive restructuring and value congruent action. There's a big spiritual component to moral injury as well. It is not the case that only people who are religious or spiritual get moral injury. A person, regardless of their religious or spiritual affiliations or not, may have difficulties related to moral injury. But for those who report some kind of spiritual component, there have been a number of treatments developed that are spiritually integrated. These include the Building Spiritual Strength intervention, which is a manualized group intervention that's co-facilitated by a VA mental health provider and chaplain, as well as the Reclaiming Experiences and Loss intervention that targets PMIEs from the perspective of grief and loss. So end-of-life care consideration. These emerging treatments that address moral injury are often delivered by mental health clinicians and or chaplains across 60 to 90-minute sessions, primarily in specialty mental health clinics like VA outpatient PTSD clinics. They haven't been formally disseminated across the VA, and they definitely haven't been in a standardized way incorporated into palliative or hospice care settings. Also, these interventions may be less appropriate in palliative and hospice settings, given that there is a lack of sensitivity to end-of-life concerns. And for that reason, I want to bring up life review exercises, which are pretty common in end-of-life, whether they're spontaneous or guided, when a person is approaching death or experiencing some kind of life-limiting illness and experiencing some of the symptoms, kind of retrudging up symptoms that are related to moral injury. The process of life review typically involves reflecting on and evaluating one's life experiences, and moral injury can complicate the process in a number of ways, especially if veterans have not made sense of their experiences. They may run into biographical conflicts where it's difficult for them to kind of integrate, am I a good person, am I not a good person? They may have relational conflicts where they have, because of that tendency to withdraw from others, that they're trying to reconnect to in late life. And then there may also be spiritual conflicts that ensue. So I want to talk a little bit about the implications of moral injury for end of life. In many cases, people who have experienced a moral injury feel like they don't deserve good things, including to die with dignity. They might reject care if they believe that they need to suffer to atone for what they did or failed to do. And that can make it really hard as a provider to give people kind of the respect and honor this last stage of life that involves death and dying. Individuals may want to disclose about their morally injurious experiences or apologize to close others. I've kind of hinted to this a few times, but many of us affiliate with people who share similar values that we have. And so when we condemn ourselves for violating some important value that we hold, we often perceive that the people we're closest to are going to reject us, right? So that perceived rejection follows with self-condemnation. And because of that, we isolate ourselves, for decades sometimes from close others. And so you may end up with veterans who don't have caregivers to be with them at this time, or you may end up with people that kind of have a mixed relationship with the veteran because the veteran has tried to remain distant. And so in many cases, veterans may feel like they have unfinished business where they want to apologize to close others for the ways in which the moral injury symptoms have impacted those others over the course of the veteran's life. They may also have difficulty accepting death if they feel guilty or ashamed and feel like they're running out of time to make amends. So I can tell you that guilt and shame are meant to be adaptive, right? Like in many cases, I'll give the example with veterans that with parents raising children, it is the case that they often do things that we ask them not to do, and then they feel guilty because they know they weren't supposed to do it. And that guilt helps them align their behavior with what their parents has asked them to do. And that is adaptive guilt. But sometimes barriers get in the way to us being able to resolve guilt. And one of those barriers is perceived impossibility of making amends. And I see that with veterans at every stage of life who feel like they can't forgive themselves because the only person who can forgive them is dead, or the person is on the other side of the planet, or they don't know how to contact them if they wanted to. And as time goes and a veteran encounters, death and dying, and they feel like time is running out to make amends, it may make it more difficult for them to accept death. And then finally, there may be religious and spiritual struggles. So people may question religious and spiritual beliefs and rituals that are related to death and dying. And oftentimes I have seen what I'll call, or what others have called, religious residue. So people will disaffiliate with a previously held faith tradition because they find it difficult to integrate with their morally injurious experiences. But I'm sure, as many people listening to this presentation have experienced, that end of life can really shake up a person's religious and spiritual beliefs. And so even though they may have spent decades identifying as a non-religious person, it may lead them back to questions about what does death mean and evaluating the goodness of their life. And that may make it, they may consequently experience religious and spiritual struggles like questioning meaning in life, or whether they have followed their moral principles and are a good person. So I want to talk a little bit about the clinical application of forgiveness, because that's what's kind of brought me as a researcher to be interested in moral injury. So forgiveness is a really animating concern among veterans seeking care for moral injury. And I often bring the topic up in sessions using questions like this. So I wanted to share those with you. I'll often ask veterans questions like, has the event that you experienced made it difficult to forgive yourself or other people? And if so, in what ways? Also, what do you think would be the benefits of forgiving yourself or others? And if there are benefits, also, what are the drawbacks? And finally, whether it's a source of comfort or struggle for you currently, how important is it that you forgive yourself or forgive others? There's actually been a lot of research done on forgiveness in particular, including at end of life, even though moral injury hasn't been specifically studied at end of life. And that's important because forgiveness is theorized to be one of the main mechanisms of therapeutic action, or one of the main ingredients of successful treatment, and focus on moral repair. And so these 5 steps that I'm presenting to you here today are an adaptation of the REACH forgiveness approach that was originally developed by Dr. Everett Worthington at Virginia Commonwealth. But these steps focus on recalling the event. So it's often helpful for individuals to disclose about an event to a benevolent other. And that could be a clinician, a chaplain, close others in a person's family or community clergy, anyone that is kind of a respected and benevolent moral authority. Next, empathize with the younger you, identifying with why you did what you did and what you didn't do, identifying what the constraints were in the situation and how you would have liked things to be different. Finally, accept the gift of forgiveness. Many times when we struggle to forgive ourselves, it is also the case that we struggle to receive forgiveness from other people. And I can tell you that shows up as if we have higher standards for ourselves than the people we're close to have for us. We have higher standards for ourselves than people say that, their God or higher power has for them. It is unbelievable how high people's standards are for themselves. And sometimes with those high standards, it becomes impossible to forgive yourself. So really acknowledging what's realistic here and exploring ways of receiving that forgiveness. So in many cases, it's important to acknowledge that forgiveness happens in our own skin. It doesn't necessarily involve reconciliation with the other party. And because of that, you can have letter writing exercises that focus on, even at bedside, that would focus on writing a letter to a person who was wronged by whatever event you're concerned about, expressing, your apology related to it, what you've done to try and sort of improve the legacy and make up for that, make those amends. I've also done some imaginal exposures where veterans imagine kind of talking at the gravesite of a person who was killed during combat. And then even with some faith traditions, this can be a really good time to refer to chaplains who can facilitate confession processes and forgiveness processes that are specific to, very many different faith traditions. So we've recalled, we've empathized, we've accepted forgiveness from others, and now we commit to practicing self-compassion. It's essential that we acknowledge our capacity for growth alongside the limitations and mistakes that we make as humans, and then hold on to forgiveness. I can tell you that there are different dimensions of forgiveness. We have this decisional components where we decide to forgive, and then there's an emotional component. And just like when we forgive other people, we make that decision, but we go around them, and sometimes it still gets our blood pressure up. It's because those emotions lag. And that can also happen when we think about forgiving ourselves, because we can make a decision to forgive ourselves, but those self-condemning emotions that we feel can lag behind. It's important to note here that there are a number of health benefits of forgiveness, and this is a lot of the things that I use to get buy-in in work with veterans. So veterans and civilians who practice forgiveness tend to report decreased depression, anxiety, hostility, and stress. They have increased hope and perceived control, lower blood pressure and risk of heart attack, better immune system function, and better sleep, greater relationship satisfaction, and enhanced meaning in life. And I think I would be remiss to not acknowledge here that there's a huge role for chaplains as well. So chaplains can serve veterans from all faiths, traditions, and denominations. They can extend access to moral injury care well beyond specialty mental health, where it tends to live in VA currently. They can conduct religious and spiritual histories and other assessment, especially when people view kind of the PMIE that they implicate themselves in as a desecration of what they hold sacred. They can provide pastoral and spiritual support, administer religious and spiritual rituals and death rites, and facilitate communication between veterans, families, and providers when moral injury complicates those relationships. And then finally, to point out that in addition to my work with veterans, I do a lot of work with healthcare workers, and I can tell you that hospice and palliative care has been identified as a hotspot for healthcare-related PMIE exposure as well. This was especially the case during the COVID-19 pandemic, when enforcing infection control precautions had the potential to do collateral harm. For example, visitation restriction during the pandemic for infected persons who were dying. Also, clinicians who felt like they didn't have, or they were constrained by insufficient time or staff shortages that affected the care relationship or care quality. In many cases, there were role conflicts that led to moral injury, where people felt like working conditions put clinicians' families at risk, especially if they had an immunocompromised family member at home. And then finally, making decisions that may have contributed to inequitable outcomes. For example, if people with difficulties around financial security or race-related differences in survival and outcomes among infected persons with COVID-19. And I would just point this out that in many ways, moral injury is an individual syndrome with roots in organizational causes, and that underscores the importance of us as clinicians practicing self-care, seeking consultation when appropriate, and making sure that our leadership has our back in terms of contributing to a healthy work climate. So in this last part of the presentation, I'm going to ask Mr. McKee to join us, and he's just going to share resources that are available through the National Center for PTSD Consultation Program.
Thank you, Dr. Griffin. Hello, everyone. Just going to take a few moments to share some free resources from the National Center for PTSD. And although I'll move pretty quickly through all these, you'll be able to download the slides and have these links available. And I'll also share with you how you can contact us anytime you have a question. On the next slide, show you that we have a summary, one written for providers of the current research on moral injury and PTSD. So that's a good place that you can go to see everything summarized, and that includes references if you want to read further. And then our web content, we usually also develop into a page written for veterans and the public, and that's written at an 8th grade level. So I provide that link there for you as well. And then of course we have the MIDS tool that's available for download. Dr. Griffin explained that in detail. We do have a lot of other resources on the website that I think are very relevant to the population that you're working with. We have information both about PTSD at the end of life, and in like a summary written for the website, and also there's a recorded lecture about that that's available for you to watch as well. And then we have some information that summarizes what's known about assessing and treating PTSD in older adults. Those web pages are there too. For educating veterans and family members, we provide a number of print materials. I wanted to feature this Understanding PTSD series, which is available both in English and Spanish. There's one written especially for veterans, one written for family members, and then we also have a version for older adults. These are available for download from our website as a PDF, or you can order print copies from the link that's provided there. Our About Face video gallery is full of veterans talking in their own words about how PTSD treatment helped them. And we're excited to say that Dr. Griffin and I and some other colleagues are currently working with the producer of About Face to add a section that's related to moral injury. So coming later this year, there will be videos there of veterans talking about their experience of moral injury and how they've been able to how they've experienced treatment, how it's been helpful to them. So look for that. If you haven't explored this website before, I encourage you to do so. Then finally, I want to tell you about our consultation program that's available to any provider. And when we use the word provider, we don't just mean mental health providers. We really mean any professional who's working with veterans who can ask us any question related to moral injury and PTSD, or related to PTSD in veterans more broadly. This the program is very easy to use. We try to have a program that's not bureaucratic, so there's no form to fill out. You simply can email us or call us with a question. We like to say that no question is too big or too small. So you can ask us about, if you're searching for a particular resource for family members, we're able to answer those sorts of questions. If you'd like to discuss a particular case, or the way that you're noticing a particular veteran behaving related to moral injury and PTSD, we're happy to have one of the expert clinicians on our team talk with you by phone or by video conference. All of those services are free, and these are not just for mental health providers. Any provider, such as a nurse working in a hospice program, a case manager, a chaplain, any provider who's working with veterans can use this program. And we don't ask you for specific identifying information about the veteran. It's a confidential program. You simply ask us your question, and we're able to get in touch with you in a timely way. to do that. So we just wanted to make sure that you knew that there's there are these additional resources and supports available to you, and we hope that we'll hear from you on a regular basis. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your time and attention. It's been great to share with you about our work on moral injury, and we're so incredibly grateful for the work that you're doing with veterans at End of Life.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Griffin and Todd. This was truly wonderful. I think I probably speak for many of our attendees when I say I took a lot of notes. I think Dr. Griffin, especially your insight as a clinician and your prioritization of making scales that are easy to use are something that are going to be really, really valuable for our attendees. I also think a lot of the, interventions you shared around letter writing and loving kindness meditation and forgiveness, those really resonated with me as well. And I'm sure many of our attendees, I know when I was a hospice social worker, those were common interventions we used. So really helpful to hear that. So now I'd like to transition to some questions. We got some really good questions in the chat. So I will read these out to you. So our first question comes from Reshma, and she asks, when you did the pre-testing, what common themes emerged that transcended the civilian category and military category?
That's an excellent question. One of the things that really stood out to me was in kind of the first decade of moral injury research, we talked so much about guilt and shame because it's such an important part of the emotional response to feeling personally or collectively responsible for a perceived transgression. But one of the important things to say is that veterans, healthcare workers, you can do everything right in a situation and still walk away with a moral injury. And one of the reasons for that is that we have many ethical standards. And in a lot of the most difficult moral injury situations, you have more than one overlapping standard that is potentially conflicting. So it's basically you have two important values and you have to pick one. And that contributed to such a sense of helplessness that I think our military veterans and healthcare workers and first responders identify with, because there was no right path forward. And I think that was such an important message in developing the scale that you can do everything right and still walk away with the moral injury. It doesn't mean that you fell down on your standards of ethics or rules of engagement or that sort of thing. It's a great question.
Thank you. And we also got a lot of questions, and I think, Todd, you mentioned this, but will the slides be available for us to share with the attendees after as well? Yep, awesome. I know lots of people were asking about that. We also got a question from Jolie who asks, is there research regarding why some people come away with PTSD and or moral injury in the same situation as someone else who does not?
There's a lot of research that has been focused on kind of risk factors for development of moral injury and PTSD. I will say, though, that the moral injury literature is quite young, right? You really need to be able to identify probable moral injury to be able to determine what might predispose a person to develop clinically significant moral injury symptoms. And we've only been able to identify that probable moral injury. The article with the MIDS was published just this year. So it's a very recent thing to be able to do. But in our work with the MIDS, in that first publication, you'll see that identification with a minoritized racial or ethnic group was associated with higher risk of positive screen on the MIDS. And we think one of the reasons for that might be is that these individuals might identify with the victim of a perceived transgression. So if they in the past have been victimized, they may feel complicit for not intervening to prevent someone else from being the victim of discrimination or violence, and that could predispose them to feeling greater guilt and the host of other morally injurious symptoms from the exposure. But there's a lot more that will need to come out on that, because this is just kind of very preliminary data that I'm sharing with you.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting to hear about that racial disparity and that explanation. We also have from Tara, she asks, I noticed that your initial questions do not include Something was done to me that violates my own morals or values. I have seen this in other definitions of moral injury and wonder why you chose to eliminate that piece.
That's a really great question. So there's no gold standard conceptualization of moral injury. And because of that, you can see different scales that are out there to assess moral injury kind of landing in different places. For us, we focus on betrayal as not a potentially morally injurious event per se, because the kinds of reactions that a person gets when they're the victim are very different from the kinds of reactions that a person might report when they feel personally or collectively responsible. But you will notice, if you look really closely, that there is an item in the MIDS that talks about feeling betrayed by leaders or institutions, because that's a context that moral injury often occurs in. And I can tell you one of the most interesting things in the MIDS data set was that that item was almost ubiquitously endorsed. So people were more likely to endorse that betrayal item than any other item. But it was also the item that loaded weakest on the overall scale. So the betrayal item wasn't a very strong indicator of who had more severe symptoms, just because everyone felt betrayed. And so we try to really include it in as a sort of a consequence of a potentially morally injurious event, but we really wanted to hone in on one type of exposure for moral injury and leave betrayal trauma, institutional betrayal trauma, PTSD as these separate trauma types that are worth studying in their own right.
Thank you. And we also have an anonymous attendee asking, is there a program specifically for chaplains or other religious officials that struggle with moral injury?
There isn't an intervention that has been specifically developed that is focused on chaplains as participants. There are a few that chaplains deliver to veterans, but I can say that even in my own practice, I've seen a number of healthcare workers, I've seen a number of chaplains who are able to adapt the letter writing exercises, the compassion meditations in order to kind of adhere to that really unique role that they have of supporting people and also being in the trenches with people. It's such a unique role that I think it can predispose folks to moral injury because you feel so close to your people and so responsible for their well-being. So when they are not well, or when there are outcomes that they experience that you can't control, it can really predispose you to certain moral injury symptoms.
Yeah, and I'll also share, we have a ton of resources that are available through the VA's whole health program that could also be useful as well too. And I'll have to tell you, we have so many questions. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but I'll try to just squeeze in 2 more here. Becky is asking, I thanked a veteran for his service, and he said, if you knew what I did, you wouldn't thank me. What is the best response that I could offer a veteran who responds this way? What is the best way to recognize a veteran's service when they have a moral injury as a result of their service?
That's a really great point. So you'll often find that when people experience a moral injury, they will reject other people's positive evaluations of themselves. And so it is very common for people to get awards or to, be praised, and they end up feeling like they don't deserve it. And so in many cases with my patients, we talk about what it's like for them to experience these positive evaluations and what it means to them to hear kind of thank you for your service, or the ways that you have contributed to the country. But I do think in many situations, those short interactions are hard to unpack all of what surrounds a moral injury.
Yeah, and then for our final question, let's see, I'll try to choose a good one. Liz asks, given the distinction between PTSD and moral injury and the fact that they're often comorbid, how often do you think moral injury is conflated with PTSD or misdiagnosed and thus undertreated? Could under or misdiagnosis be responsible for unmanaged PTSD symptoms?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole point of developing the MIDS was so that we could parse out what is PTSD, what is moral injury, and get people to the treatments that are best prepared to help them with the problems that they're experiencing. So that is a huge motivation behind this in order to improve the effectiveness of the treatments that we're administering.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. This was so incredibly valuable. As a reminder for everyone attending, the recording will be posted on the We Honor Veterans site. I just want to thank Mr. Griffin and Todd McKee again for joining us. This was wonderful. Really, really appreciate it. A couple really brief just reminders in terms of We Honor Veterans and NHPCO. We have another webinar coming up on July 29th. It's going to be part of our dementia series. So I will put that information in the chat. And then additionally, if you are an NHPCO member or looking to become one, we also have our annual leadership conference coming up in Denver. But thank you again, and please don't hesitate to reach out, review this material, share it with your staff, and just continue to provide the highest level of support to veterans at end of life. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.